Welcome back to Catholic Hawk 45.
I'm Anthony, and my good friend Frank is joining me once again for our second installment of really covering Italian fascism, liberalism, and also communism. And so, first of all, I want to say that we are not promoting fascism on this cast, but what we are going to do is dig down and get to the bottom of what fascism was really all about, because we have an issue in the MAGA wing. We have an issue with certain right-wing talking heads throwing the word fascism at far leftists that clearly hold up communist flags that are clearly being supported by international communists. And there is a confusion about, well, what is communism and what is fascism? Because right now we seem to be in some kind of a hybrid that nobody can tease out. Well, Frank and I are going to do that for you right now. And I think before we get into Italian fascism, Frank, we definitely are going to need some background on the French Revolution, because that really was, I believe, the catalyst for this. And also kind of the, I believe, the American reaction here in the United States to, as bloody as the French Revolution got, was generally one of kind of astonishment and horror, if I'm not mistaken. So how does that all kind of tie in with, moving forward into this scenario where we see a rise of fascism and communism? What does the French Revolution have to do with all of this? And I know we don't have time to cover it in a great length, but just briefly, what are your thoughts on how that moved us forward to what we're looking at now?
Well, thank you, Anthony, for having me back on. This is a very interesting topic here, and for my part, there's a level of frustration in our political discourse in America where, with the social media kind of punditry that we see, we often lose focus on real, meaningful dialogue. And as somebody who is a lover of history, I hate it. I truly despise it when history is cut and pasted by pseudo historians, right? I think with fascism, while clearly it has its historical problems, it has a heavy hand in history that comes off as, well, not so pretty, let's put it that way. We have to be fair and balanced in regards to its sort of philosophical positions, right? And that's kind of where I think both the left and the right in America kind of shortcut it, and we've turned the word into something to where, it's used to as a hammer of sorts to beat each other over the head with, at least with the left and the right. But I think you're right in the sense that it does start with the French Revolution and the aftermath of the French Revolution in Europe. And what the French Revolution does, starting from the end of the 17th century all the way through the 18th century, effectively, is create social, civil, and moral chaos throughout all of the European continent. We see revolution after revolution, even these things we call unification, right? Like the unification of Germany, the unification of Italy. They're really revolutions, oftentimes Masonic in origin. We still got this divide between Catholics and Protestants as well, too. And then we begin to see, as a result of these revolutions, these new ideologies of the far left, like communism, socialism, anarchism of the sorts. And so fascism really rises at a time where the Catholic world is really confused and trying to figure out how they're going to govern. But it arises again when Europe is absolutely chaotic, and the moral breakdown that the French Revolution brought. Let's remember, naked lady liberty. France was full of pornography, and we see that moral decadence really play out in large parts of Europe where the French Revolution grabbed a hold. Now, there was parts of Europe where Christendom continued to reign, and the sexual revolution throughout that period did not reign. But clearly the French Revolution caused havoc in many parts of the world. And by the time we get to right around, let's call it World War I era, the monarchs have been dethroned. or delegitimized, or they've lost their power at that point. Catholics are trying to figure out how they're going to govern in post-monarchical Europe. Liberalism is running rampant with all kinds of different ideas and beliefs. Communism, Bolshevism is running through the continent, and they're pretty brutal at what they do. And in many ways, a lot of what we call these Catholic nations are faced with tough choices, and Catholics were trying to figure out a way that they were going to survive here. Now, when I talk about fascism, I'm not talking about that, that Austrian painter over there that we talk about, because that was National Socialism. I'm talking about something more akin to what was in Italy and in Spain and other parts of Europe that were more Catholic-centered nations. And clearly the French Revolution puts the entire European continent in a state of chaos and really sets the premise for World War I and what is to come after that. Anthony.
That's a good point. Let's parse out the difference between Italian fascism, fascism with a big F, what would historically be considered real fascism, and really the only fascism that ever rose truly, and Mustache Man's National Socialism. What are some major differences there? I understand that Germany had this mythos about itself that it built up, and Italy had its own kind of mythos that it built up, but that's not uncommon. I mean, that's not something that's characteristic of only fascism. I mean, we have to a certain degree here in the United States, we have a degree of mythos about the founding fathers. So really kind of could you dig into the differences so people really understand the difference between perhaps somebody like Mussolini and the type of real fascism he presided over, let's call it, and the National Socialism that Mustache Man presided over?
Well, see, that's a fascinating question, because what you effectively have is a strange alliance between really Catholic nations and Hitler, kind of like we have a strange alliance, right, between America and Stalin in many ways. War makes strange bedfellows, and that's what you wind up having. I think Hitler, being a neo-pagan and implementing sort of his own socialist system, I think, as most historians have said, it was a unique system that was uniquely German. And Germany has always kind of done things their own way, right? Well, I think in Italy, and even in Spain in some respects, or any Catholic nation, there's always been this tie back not only to Catholicism, but back to Christendom. And I think that was the end goal here for fascism. It was one of the many ideologies that arose at that time as an attempt to get back to the corporatist Christian state, which was based upon the medieval guild system, which many would argue was a very effective system in the old world. Remember, fascism is seen as a counter-revolutionary ideology. A counter-revolutionary ideology that looked to fight back not only against communism and classical liberalism, but really, if you look at the far right in Europe at that time, it's quite different than, let's say, the right in America. Because the right in America is essentially a child of liberalism in many ways, right? They're classical liberals. But there's one thing that really all these right-wing movements in Europe had in common at the time, and we touched on this earlier. They were anti-French Revolution, and they were all trying to figure out how they were going to govern their civilizations, again, post the fall of Christendom, and trying to go back to something of the past, something that had worked very effectively, which was the medieval guild system, was very attractive to fascists and other ideologies sort of on that right-wing camp. And I think that's the difference in many ways, is that the fascists had something of the past that they could go back into, while Germany in and of itself, Hitler created his own unique system that was devoid of any true religious reverence or the past, related to Christendom.
Okay, we're already beginning to tear some of this down, this idea of the right wing throwing this word fascism at communists. It just doesn't make much sense, international communists. And I think as we get into the economy and how this functions for all of these different ideologies, we're going to see a really definitive difference there. And also with religion, because you brought up religion. And of course, fascist Italy was Catholic. You have America, which is also nationalistic, just like Italy was, has its own national pride and mythos, and they're Protestant for the most part. And then you've got, of course, Russia and other countries that have embraced international communism, and they're atheist. And then you've got, of course, Hitler, who's thrown the Catholic Church out the window, is planning on persecuting them. And he's trying to create this pagan kind of pure bloodline. If I'm not mistaken, we just didn't see that kind of racism in fascist Italy. And so a couple of points. Number one, why do you think we didn't see that racism in fascist Italy to the degree that we see it in Nazi Germany? And then what is it that is so special about the guild system? How is fascism trying to move this old idea forward into the modern age? What does like a Christian corporatist state generally kind of look like?
Well, that's a fascinating question in regards to race. I think part of it has to do with the fact that because Italy, going all the way back to the time of the Roman Empire, was a very diverse population, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that there's not a really big hang-up with race in Italy per se. Listen, I'm Sicilian, okay? And like I joke around all the time, we Sicilians, we do pluralism right. We got pluralism right. And that's because I probably have blood in me that's of Norman descent and Greek and, Roman and Arab and really all over the world, because it was an island that was conquered time and time again by different areas of the world. And so in that respect, race never really played a role in Italy, and that's why you see, sort of different racial demographics of how Italians are composed in many ways, from light skin to darker skin and things like that. And I think you see this reflected in Mussolini himself, who his brand of fascism was not racial one bit. In fact, you had Jewish fascists, you had Arab fascists, and Mussolini's definition of what a good Italian was somebody that spoke Italian. For that matter, I believe two of Mussolini's top generals were actually Jews. So we don't see that. Now, some people will bring up later on, late in sort of his regime, he passes some anti-Jewish laws where he prohibits interracial marriage. I believe some Jews are ousted. Absolutely not a bright spot in his administration. But I think, in all fairness, if I remember correctly, that's when Italy was losing the war and he came under influence of Hitler very strong. Remember, toward the end of that war, Mussolini was set up as a puppet leader of the Republic of Salo, I believe, in the north, after he was asked to step down by the king, and Hitler had to rescue him out of prison, and a lot of that stuff happens. Because remember, Italy really wasn't ready to fight this war. I think there was a lot of ambition. Italy was never an industrial nation. It didn't have the war capacity that other nations like America had, and they figured out pretty quick they weren't going to be a strong force in this war. And so that affected a lot of decisions that were made later on. But for Italians, race has never been that big of an issue, per se. I mean, so that's issue number one there. Now, as far as the issue of the medieval guild system, the way it's been described to me and the way I've studied it is that it had some nice benefits. The first and foremost, which I think would attract a lot of American conservatives, is that it was based upon local subsidiarity. And that is what we would call limited government in America. And that is that the guild would control in a very localized region of your country a particular guild of a particular industry, whether they were farmers or shoemakers or leather makers, whatever you may have. And they would control a region, they would control the means of trade, and in that respect, they would bring together the entire industry for the benefit of the industry. There was, I guess, the guild was a voice for the industry so it could efficiently run. Right? There's some more issues there, don't get me wrong. The other benefit that were there was it was an insurance policy for everybody within that industry. If you got hurt, disabled, you died, they took care of your widow, right? The other issue was that, again, they managed trade, right? And local trade, especially, to the benefit of the local community. And the other issue that was very important, again, religion here, there was always, for every guild, there was a dedication and a reverence to the faith, to a saint. There was actually, again, a dedication and to a saint, which brought a religious element to the guild in itself, which brought a sense of truth and justice to the guild. So, again, becoming corrupt, again, we have a fallen human nature, but once you get the saints, the sacramentals, the church involved, it's a little bit more hard to corrupt business and industry rather than a secular society like we see today where big business grows without any consideration to true justice and virtue and morality. The guild played a vital role in protecting the industry, protecting workers, maintaining faith, truth, and justice. From my understanding, it was a beautiful system.
I think, Frank, Americans of any stripe would be interested in what you just described. And if I'm not mistaken, I think the modern pension system also came from the ideas that the guilds had. And you just named off a whole host of awesome stuff. But I think when we're getting into the economy, you're really starting to touch on this idea that, there is this difference that's important between what fascism was trying to do and their concern about what international communism was trying to do. And part of that has to do with the central banking system, which I believe is a plank of international communism. So maybe you could speak to that. And then also we hear these right-wing talking heads. They just seem to be confused about the nature of power when it comes to fascism, because you got people like Dinesh D'Souza, for instance, quoting Mussolini about the state, like the state is everything. Well, of course, the state was given primacy in fascism, and that may have been one of its drawbacks. We can talk about that later and how the church eventually responded to Mussolini. But what I'm concerned about is this idea as if Dinesh is conflating this idea of centralized state with a communist centralized state, as if international communism is the same thing as fascism. And so if you could break that down for us and explain why these two things are so different.
Well, yeah, that's one of the stranger things, right? You have two, centralized powers that are, brutally murdering each other in the streets. It kind of doesn't make sense in a way, right? And so then we have to get down to what some of these differences actually are. I think one is an emphasis on nationalism, national pride, national origin, protecting your country, which is fascism, while communism has an overemphasis on internationalism. They're looking to spread their message and their ideas and their principles all over the world. And so that makes it two vastly different ideologies. Listen, the financial sector, the bankers, the international bankers, they were all over that era and that time, and it's one of the things the fascists were against because they thought they would lose their national interest and their national identity and effectively indebt their own people to these international financiers. Now, in regards to the war, that was a strength of theirs, but it was a weakness as well too. Let's remember, in Catholic societies, usury, which is excessive debt, is a mortal sin. In classical liberal nations and communist nations, debt is not a sin from my understanding. We've never had a problem with that. And so there's some basic philosophical principles, but what you have effectively, and the reason why I believe the war is won by the Allies, is the fact that there is a central bank. They're able to print money and run debt and build a bigger, stronger military because they're allowed to run all this debt. While, in Italy, you got the Italian citizens, primarily the upper class and the middle class, turning in their gold. So that's how Italy was funding their military power, and it just wasn't enough in that respect, right? So international financiers played a role. The fascist leaders and really the whole Catholic world, saw problems with this, and they predicted a lot of the problems we would have in the future, like today, the heavy debt usury system we have today. A lot of those fascist leaders actually called this is what it would be. It's why we've sold our souls in modern times now, particularly with Americans we're buying all of our stuff from China, and the American economy has become nothing but a service sector economy for the most part with no industry. That has a lot to do with financing and banking and things like that. So I think the international financiers is an important point to remember. Now let me address your other point. Yeah, and in regards to the power of the state, historian Charles Colomb has said that one of the weaknesses of fascism was this sort of adherence to the state, a sort of a state worship. Now, for Italy, it's a little complex because you have to understand Italy's history a little bit. Remember, between the Garibaldi unification of Italy, which happened in the 1860s, World War I and World War II, these three traumatic events, you effectively could have lived through all of these events, major changes in Italy in one lifetime. Italy being a nation that was very decentralized under the Papal States, right? Because it was really governed by a whole host of different nations and kingdoms, right? The South, I think, was governed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the North by the Lombardies, you had the Papal States in the middle. So these were smaller provinces, and in many respects, like I've said so many times before, the Catholics did limited government, what we call subsidiarity. We did it right. Our ancestors did it right. And that locum subsidiarity, you can really see it by the different cultures and languages and regions within the Italian peninsula and how they varied. In many respects, there was a bunch of little different countries on that Italian peninsula. And so, but when we get to, again, post-French Revolution, we're forcefully unifying a lot of these, again, countries. Like we had the unification of Germany, we had the unification of Italy now, and these things are being force-fed together. The question is, for Italians was, what do we do with Italy? Do we remain small and providential in that sense, with small provinces, or do we put Italy together? Remember, there's also this history, this glory of Italy that goes all the way back to the Roman Empire, right? Where Italy was this proud nation that goes all the way back for a couple thousand years at the very least. And there was a question of whether Italy should be that one nation again. But again, because it's broken down by providence for so long, no national origin, at least, as a whole on that entire peninsula, there's a lack of national continuity. And so when the fascists get into power, especially Mussolini, because Mussolini's idea was to try and put something back that looked something akin to the Roman Empire. That was one of his great ambitions, and maybe one of his weaknesses, one of his ideas that actually he took too far. But this was his idea. How do you put Italy together and make it a nation state? Well, the fascists used the idea of the state. Whether it was right or wrong, it was about unifying Italy in that sense. And I think that plays into the history. You have to understand the nuances. Listen, this isn't America, which is a rural society, between, the ratification of the Constitution all the way to the Civil War, really. You effectively don't have any issues. You got those borders of water that are protecting you, but we're talking about Europe here at a time of great unrest, geopolitical unrest, and how the Italians deal with these geopolitical issues and try to find an identity. The fascists are dealing with that at the time. The whole peninsula is.
Right. So I guess you have these international communists coming in, and we know what international communism does. We see it playing out here in the States. They try and destroy all culture, destroy anything related to your country's past. Really have to make it in the image of the revolution, which seems to be just perpetual revolution in some sense, until you get people in there that are strong enough to kind of control the entire state or apparatus. And of course, communism is condemned by the Catholic Church. Socialism is condemned by the Catholic Church. I don't believe that fascism was ever condemned, but because of Mussolini's proclivity towards the state, Mussolini was reprimanded by the Pope rather strongly in a public encyclical letter. And so, there is that point about the state that became an issue because there were some groups of Catholics meeting within the Catholic Church, and he shut down those things. And I think there was a concern there of communism, and communism finding a place to kind of hide out. Now, whether that was the case or not, I don't know, but clearly he should have gone through the church, and he didn't. And this is where the power of the state is one of the areas where that got him into trouble. But really, Frank, I don't think that when Dinesh D'Souza talks about the state, when he's quoting Mussolini, is his concept of the state the same as Mussolini's concept of the state would have been?
Yeah, that encyclical you're referring to was entitled No Abbiamo Bisogno by, I believe, Pope Pius XI, right? No abbiamo bisogno. We have of no need, okay? And it was a condemnation because, this is the negative part about fascism, right? It does become heavy-handed. And I think it's one of the legitimate criticisms of classical liberalism when you have, again, a sort of top-heavy style government. Now, the problem with our classical liberal friends is they never address the weaknesses of democracy and republicanism, which always turns into communism eventually. But they are right when it says, when they say that fascism becomes sort of heavy-handed in its authoritarian implementation. And we see that, and that's why I think the church steps up. And there's some bad things that happen. Now, some things were bad, some things were necessary. You're fighting communists in the streets. We have to look at these things individually to see what they were. Again, difficult times. You're being invaded by Bolsheviks. So we kind of got to read through all the gray areas as well, too. But I think in general, fascism can lead to an abuse that should be somewhat worrisome without a doubt. Now, as far as, the definition of what the state is, I find that interesting. The likes of D'Souza will tell you that, okay, when Mussolini promotes the state, that means he's promoting centralized government. Well, again, I don't think it quite works that way when you're promoting the Christian corporatist medieval guild system, because that was purely localized economies, and that's what they were shooting for. When you talk about the state, what is the state in fascist ideology when it comes to things like, okay, the economy, for example? Well, the state is Naples. The state is Verona. The state is Tuscany. The state is Sicily. The state is Bari, right? It's your local economies that are the state that would run big segments of your economy in that respect. Now, the centralized government in Rome would have their responsibilities, kind of like in America today, right? The feds have their responsibility to be our military and to protect our borders and to, regulate trade and whatever it is our federal government does. There was a distribution of power that the fascists saw. But one of the things, again, that the old world did, that in America we have always failed to do, even though we've championed this idea, is the idea of limited government. Since the founding of America, we've seen government grow and grow and grow and grow. Granted, it's a little slow. I won't say a little slow. After the Civil War, it grows on steroids. I get that. But again, even prior to the Civil War, America, pre-industrial revolution, in a big, vastly big agricultural nation where everybody probably doesn't even see each other half the time because we're so spread apart, it probably government is growing at a slower pace. But in a place where a continent like Italy, where it's much smaller geographically, it's been civilized for 2,000 years, it's not nearly as agricultural, or at least as rural, I should say. Well, guess what? Things move a little bit faster in that region of the world. That's why the French Revolution was so devastating, right? That's why liberalism spreads so much faster in Europe than it did in America, right? You could have these Protestant sects in America hide out in their small little, enclaves in the middle of BFE, right? And so when we say the state, we have to differentiate between what's at Rome and what's at the local level. Again, the guild system was about keeping everything at a local level. And it worked for a very long time in the Catholic world. And that's where I believe many classical liberals like Mr. Dinesh D'Souza get confused.
Yes, definitely. With communism, you truly do have a centralized state where the centralized state is running every facet of everything, true central planning of an economy. So even within this uniparty state, and I think that would be Dinesh's criticism of Italian fascism, is that, well, it's a uniparty, right? But even within this uniparty state, as you point out, you have decentralization of the economy. Now, funny thing here, right? What about the United States? What about us? Are we a decentralized economy? Or do we have a command and control economy? Do we have two parties, or do we actually have a uniparty, Frank?
Yeah, well, as somebody who left during the reign of the neocons from the political right party in this country, I would tell you there for a while we had a uniparty. Does MAGA change that now? Maybe. I'm open for a discussion on that. But for a while we did have a uniparty. Listen, I think the other thing we have to address here, Anthony, is a definition of what a corporation is, because this is where a lot of the confusion of the classical liberals come. And this is what you see a lot right now, right? Is that the right is throwing the word fascist at the left, saying, okay, Mussolini and his government aligned with the big business in Italy, and they colluded to take over the economy and the political structure, and they dominated the entire, fascist state. Well, okay, let's talk about that for a second. Because the definition of corporation is different than how we see it in America today. The corporation in Italy in 1930s wasn't a big conglomerate business, right? It wasn't Google. It wasn't Apple. It wasn't General Electric. It wasn't Ford or Tesla. It was none of these. The corporate state in Italy was simply what? It was the guild system. The corporation was the individual guilds that managed the particular benefits or the particular industry of whatever the particular guild was trying to protect. Whether, again, the farmers or the fishermen or the steel makers or the car makers, whatever you had, that was the corporation. It was an alliance of all these groups that came together for the betterment of the industry itself. It wasn't a single business per se like we define in America. Remember, Italy Italy was a very artisan nation. It was very agriculture. It didn't even have that much industry. That's why that definition really doesn't make sense in many ways. Italians were agricultural. They were people of the land. They were fishermen. This is what they did. And in many respects, if you look at Italy today, there's still not that much industry over there, right? It never built even after World War II. What is the biggest producer for Italy today? It's tourism, right? It's its history. Its second biggest producer is bottled water and jewelry. That's what Italy makes to this very day. And it's something that wasn't big. There wasn't that industry in Italy. And so you never had these big conglomerate businesses. So we're conflating the definition of corporations, how we see it in America in modern times, versus the idea of the corporation, which was something completely different based upon the corporatist guild system. Two totally different things, two totally different makeups. Italy didn't have a Google. Italy didn't have an Apple. Italy had none of these industries, okay? It had a few of them, but not a whole lot.
All right, so essentially what I gather about Italian fascism is it's trying to bring together the government, the corporations, the way you describe them, and also the individual worker, and bring them all to the table to work out what's best for everybody. It seems very reasonable to me. Now, you tell me, is this a fair distinction? Italy is not endorsing here cutthroat capitalism, which seems to me to go back to materialism. Is that something the United States has embraced? And I'm wondering, is communism, with its kind of focus on materialism, and kind of cutthroat crony capitalism with its focus on materialism, is this where the United States went wrong? Is this where we're more like communism? And is this why MAGA is so appreciated by the American people, this America First agenda, because you actually want companies in your country that love and care about their countrymen?
Yeah, I think with the fascist system, it would acknowledge that it is capitalist. It does believe in the exchange of, the free exchange of goods and services. That's a good thing. You want the market determining prices. You don't want a government or a centralized bureaucrat dictating prices. That leads to disaster. The fascists understood that. That's how the old Catholic world worked. Fine. The issue here is free markets, right? Which is something that in America we've championed for a long time, that the right has promoted. That's where I think fascists would disagree, because there's a lack of moral principles with free markets versus a capitalism that still addresses or acknowledges a certain moral order within the realm of the economy. Now, this is where the free market guys and the libertarians all flip out. But look what we have in America today. These big conglomerate corporations have merged with government, and they've done it in the name of free markets. And there's nothing anybody can do to stop this. And let me give you a prime example, right? What the fascists would say is, let's take one of the big, tech companies in America, one of the big conglomerates that has gone overseas now. The fascists would say, wait a minute, you're an American company, you use resources here, and now you've betrayed not only your country, but you've betrayed the American worker. There's something immoral when these corporations take their business overseas in order to profit, because they can use proverbial slave labor, right? And other laws to make even more money. The fascists would say, no, you owe your duty to your country and your fellow countrymen in that respect, and not leave us like we've been left by many corporations with something that's nothing more than a service sector economy at this point. There's a great moral disorder that the fascists point out. And look what's happened really in America over the past 30, 40 years under the concept of free markets. Corporations have left. They've left the American worker behind. Wages have dropped. Corporations have profited overseas. And now that they've grown so big, without any moral order within the realm of the economy, many people are now arguing, now especially our friends on the right, they're arguing they've colluded with government. And this is their definition of fascism. And I would argue, no, that's not the definition of fascism, because the corporation, how we describe it in the medieval guild, is different than what we describe a corporation in America today. What we see today is the full fruition of the free markets, which leads to what? Oligarchical rule. This is ruled by oligarchy. What was the whole principle behind the idea of one of the great benefits of monarchy? Monarchy was designed to stop the oligarchical rise and to protect the middle class and the lower classes. Once you get rid of the monarchy, this is history 101. This is philosophy 101 here, guys. All right? Once you get rid of the monarchy, who stops the oligarchical rise? Nobody. Nobody can stop them. And what we've seen is textbook history play out in America with the rise of these corporations now colluding with government. This is the rule of the few. This is the rise of oligarchical rule. It's not fascism. It's not fascism. It's oligarchical rule. And this is where our friends on the right get a little bit confused.
Okay, and this is where things get interesting, Frank, because the right wing has been very freaked out now about this system they've essentially supported here in America seems to have turned on them. You've got Mark Zuckerberg openly cooperating now with the federal government. He admits to it. We know these other tech companies, more than likely, many of them are doing the same thing. We know for certain that AT&T is definitely, for a very long time, been letting the government end on communications. It's actually essentially a government apparatus at this point. They have a concrete building in, I believe it's New York City, that can withstand a nuclear blast. So, and this is where they gather a lot of intel. I find it disturbing too, because now we see all these corporations draping the rainbow flag over all of their logos. I don't think quote unquote woke is anything other than communism itself, that idea of state control, total centralized government, total central planning, running everything at this point. It looks to me like MAGA is the last hope for America at this point, because we have had a uniparty. We have had these international communists attempting to take over. There's memes now out there about McCarthy. You and I have been saying it for years. McCarthy was right. They thought he was a loon, and they made it out that way in our history textbooks when we were young. But now we see all this for what it is. And so, does it make any sense at the end of the day? I'd like for you to flesh this out more if you can, if I'm missing something here, because it seems to me this is communism, and that there's no way that anybody on the right wing should be pointing to this stuff and saying that's fascism, because we can't play this game that the liberals play. I mean, if we're going to be MAGA, we're going to be MAGA, right? We can't play this game with words. Words have meaning. And I think there's a fear among the right wing that if they don't throw that word fascism back at them, that somehow we're going to get stuck with it. I just get the sense that's going to backfire. So what do you see that really points to this being fascism? Is there anything I'm missing? And how could this really backfire on MAGA, do you think, by throwing that word around that way and not doing, the meaning of a word proper justice?
Well, the fact that you bring up the LGBT flag and how the corporations are draping all over the place is the perfect example of how this is not fascism. Because the fascists believe in natural law. They believe in natural family. You never would have saw the fascist nation or the corporate guild in that respect ever use the LGBT flag, right? That's number one. Number two, the fact that they are draping the LGBT flag. This is an ideology promoted by who? Communists. Not fascists, communists. Who has promoted the destruction of the family over the past century? It's been communism, not fascism. Fascists encourage you to have families, encourage you to have kids. They believe in natural family. They believe in protecting the culture. They believe in protecting the faith. They believe in protecting a national interest, right? It's been communists that have attacked the family left and right. And so I think that's one of the biggest indications right there. So I think you have that there. And so, listen, they've done a great job masking this on the far left. I mean, okay, let's look at it this way. I think part of the problem, Anthony, is with the right is they're stuck in these Cold War definitions of what left and right is, what communism is, what fascism is, right? Because we fought a Cold War against the Soviet Union where it was a brutal sort of dictatorial ideology that took its pound of flesh out on its own people and sort of the Eastern satellite nations, and the way it governed with an iron fist. But what our friends on the right have not adjusted to is how communism has adjusted along that time span. I mean, look what communism in China today. Is it brutal? Well, I mean, you may not have the freedom of speech, you may not have the freedom of religion, but what communists have figured out is that, at least in China, we're going to give our people some pleasures and some comforts. We're going to make their lives a little nicer. And communism there has embraced certain forms of capitalism because they found certain elements of benefits to embracing this capitalist system, right? Or at least the market forces in that respect. And that's where I think our friends on the right have been stuck in this kind of old Cold War ideology, not seeing that communism is very malleable. They're willing to adjust in order to, sort of fit in with the times. I think at the end of the day, I think the big difference between, again, something like fascism and communism is the fact that the communists are atheists. And everywhere they go, they suppress religion and destroy the family and destroy the culture, right? Fascists never did that. Granted, fascists had their problems. They reached over the line. They were brutal. They needed to be reprimanded. There's some issues there. But never did they, from my rendering of history, they come close even to the atrocities of what the communists committed. And at the end of the day, we've seen how communism, again, is willing to adapt and adjust. And it's a matter of people want to see these adjustments and not be refined or restricted by old definitions. Again, this is why the political right now is licking their wounds over this free market issue. They supported free markets for 40, 50, 60 years. The entire time I was in the classical liberal camp, listen to talk radio, free markets, free markets, free markets. And now all of a sudden, they've gotten screwed by the free markets with the rise of the oligarchs. They don't know what to do, Anthony.
Yeah, Frank, you're right. I think the right is throwing that term fascist at communists because they're terrified of the stigma of Mustache Man. And they've never really taken the time to figure out exactly what fascism was themselves, historically speaking. It wasn't Hitler's invention, right? It wasn't Mustache Man's invention. It was brought forth by philosophers and political philosophers in Italy, and manifested through Mussolini and some other people that helped bring that party and codify it into existence, along with its essential plan for the Italian state. Now, I think we are at a point where a lot of MAGA crowd, because I'm MAGA, I support Trump, but we're going to be left scratching our heads. Like, how do we fight this deep state? How do we fight this deep communist state? This bureaucratic, like, communist Goliath. What do we do? What are our options? Because clearly, fascism is not an option. We would not want to see fascism rise in the United States because, again, that could be equally brutal. And it seems to me that's what the communists are agitating for. They want us to essentially become fascists. They want to create the enemy that they've needed in order to fully bring in communism and codify it. So what are the options here for us in the United States, pragmatically speaking? I don't think there's anything wrong with the way the basic structure of our government. the basic structure of the Constitution as far as division of powers. But what are some things that we could adapt or do here, and maybe even looking at other countries in Europe and what they're doing?
Yeah, and that's unfortunate. I mean, the stigma of, the Austrian painter will always be there. And it's something that it's always going to be associated with, again, the fascist nations. But then on the other side, of course, like we said before, Churchill and Roosevelt aligned with Stalin. And now, the question comes down to, okay, how do we view these alliances, right? A guy like Dinesh D'Souza would say something like, well, America picked the lesser of two evils. And quite frankly, I'm stunned by that statement. The sheer numbers of deaths that came from communist countries, it's it's not even close compared to what we would call fascist nations. Well, let me take that back. What we saw from the Axis powers, right? Because the concentration camps, the main ones we saw was in Germany. They were despicable. What Hitler did was horrible, right? But you really didn't have a lot of this other stuff in a lot of these fascist nations. Now, we could talk about Spain, but Spain was a war, and there were some very difficult circumstances there. You go to Italy. Listen, the Italian government, the last two presidents have denied that there was ever anything like concentration camps in Italy. Now, there was some political prisons there, but that's part of war. We all have that, right? But as far as like something like race-based concentration camps, I haven't found too much evidence in Italy of those, right? Just political prisoners, right? So how we define these things? I mean, look at all the people that Stalin starved. He took away all their means to just grow their food. Millions died just in starvation alone. And so to say it was the lesser of two evils, I don't know what kind of history he's reading, to be honest with you. I like to see more of it. Only if you include Hitler in that midst can you make that claim. Well, you can try and make that claim. I just don't see it at all there. So, as far as the question about MAGA, I don't know. Listen, I supported Trump back in, 2000, and with the things we've seen now. I guess it's hard for me to answer that question because I'm more of a historian and a political philosopher and things of that nature. And so what we have to do or what has to be done in order to defeat these sort of far left elements, that's a great question. I think part of the problem is that every institution that the world knows right now has been captured by the left, right? From government to education to Hollywood to big business to sports teams to you name it. The left controls all the institutions, which makes this almost, a feat that's so big, a mountain so high to climb that I really don't know apart from God's grace. But at the end of the day, I guess, to bring it all around, what the fascists tried to do and what integralists and what monarchists tried to do in that confusing time in Europe is try to create some type of a confessional state at the end of the day, right? And I think the weakness with fascism is the fact that it did not have a direct association with the church. That was a big problem that fascism had, and ultimately was its greatest weakness, right? But here in the States in America, there has to be something where where we associate ourselves based upon our national Christian origins. I know that's difficult in America because the founding's very confusing concerning sort of the ideology of Christianity and the founding principles and the founding fathers who have some confusing beliefs. But I think it's time, just in simplistic terms, that Christians come together. And we have to start to agree on some basic fundamentals here and not stab each other in the back and hold our leaders accountable. I'm not very confident in democracy, but I'm also one not willing to give up and surrender because I know everything is at stake.
Well, I think you hit it on the money with God's grace. I think that we need to be taking 100 of our friends down to our local Republican county offices. We need to be taking over. We need to be getting legislation in our state legislatures to reform voting. We need to go to paper ballots. We need to go to hand count, supervised by the opposition, and we need to make sure that we have cameras on that as well, so everybody can see. That's step one, I think, as far as pragmatically speaking. And then further, it needs to be 100 friends from your church that you take down there. Because one thing we have to do is we've got to get natural law codified in this country, which is just absurd that we don't even follow natural law in this country. But that's something surely that most Christians can agree on. And we could move towards something like a confessional state, say like Hungary. I think that's very reasonable. And we would have a country that effectively would function at that point. We've got an uphill battle for sure, Frank. It's an uphill battle. I don't see an easy time ahead. I think like you, I'm not so confident in things right now with democracy because it seems to be gasping its final breath. But like you, I'm not one to give up either. I see ways that we can move forward. And we certainly don't endorse any kind of violent revolutionary action because at this point it seems that that's what the communists want. But certainly you have to defend your local communities like Kyle Rittenhouse did. Maybe it could be argued that he should not have put himself in the situation he put himself in, but there were a lot of other men there that were protecting businesses, protecting their community from essentially communist rioters. I mean, let's just be honest about who they are and what they were doing. These are not fascists. We cannot throw the word fascist at these people. They're nothing like fascists at all. It is a international communist criminal organization that lets loose inmates and criminals on the street embracing the same radical ideology, completely out of their minds on pornography and all of the perversions of the day. And it's time that we made truly the Bible the book of America again, that we embrace natural law as a country. The Catholics, Protestants, we all come together. We truly figure out how do we move forward. And we have to get serious about getting involved locally. We cannot just depend on going to vote for Trump. You need to find out how to become a delegate. You need to take over your local Republican county office. You need to be looking at how to get legislation into the state legislature. And you perhaps should consider running for state legislature, because the only way this country truly falls apart is if good people stand up and do nothing. And Frank, we can find you over at Frankly Speaking on YouTube. Thank you for being here. If you like this video, please click the like button, hit subscribe, and share this thing out with other MAGA supporters. Frank, I'm going to give you the last word here.
Well, Anthony, thank you for having me on again. I love these historical conversations. This is my cup of tea, is history, of course, and politics and culture. Just to add something to the end of this, what you said about, what do we do at this point? I'll be the first to tell you. Again, going back to fascism. Fascism in America scares the living daylights out of me. Remember, in Italy, it was a population, not only was the church in place, but it was 95 to 98% Catholic. So, to a certain respect, there was a check and balance there. In America, pluralistic culture, I don't know what we get. I know many of my friends on the right are scared about the rise of a fascist leader, if you want to use that term, but really an authoritarian, strong man of the right, that's what they're worried about. And if history, repeats itself, that could very well happen. I'm worried about that. I'm terrified about that. I'm terrified about anything concerning an authoritarian leader of the right or the left in America, because we don't have a consolidated faith or culture or religion or anything like that, and it's scary. But at the same time, we're off course here with this democracy. And the simplest solution will be to win at the ballot box, even though I have absolutely no faith in that. And I'll continue to do my duty as an American. I love my country. I love America. I may have my differences with the government, but I love my country. It's the country of my birth. It's the country that has protected me. It's the country that's given me a good life. And I think we all have something to be invested here. All we can do is pray, hope for the best, and love her the best we can. Once again, thank you, my friend, for having me on.